Good enough.
If Asanda had been up to keeping the peace in winter, though she suspected the white-haired woman's slowness would have had her chewing her tongue in frustration. Still, Asanda could not have been as slow as this goggle-eyed young Elsie. At last Elsie handed her her fur-lined crimson cloak with a curtsy, and she slung the cloak around her shoulders hastily. A fire blazed on the stove.
Give me 1 second, everyone. I messed up the little tripod.
And recently she could not seem to remember the cold with any reliability. The girl bobbed as she asked whether she could fetch men to carry down the chests if it pleased Her Majesty. The first time she had done that, Elaine had gently explained that she was not yet queen, but Elsie seemed horrified at the idea of addressing her simply as my lady, or even as princess, though in truth the last was considered very old-fashioned. Proper or not, it usually pleased Elaine to hear someone acknowledge her right to the throne, but this morning she was too tired to be anything but anxious to be on the road. Suppressing a yawn, she told Elsie curtly to fetch the men and be quick about it, and turned for the paneled door. The girl rushed to open it for her, which took longer than if she had done it herself, with a curtsy before opening and yet another after. Her divided silk skirts whispered furiously against each other as she strode out of the room, tugging on her red riding gloves. If Elsie had delayed her one more second, she thought she would have screamed. It was the girl who shrieked, however, before Elaine had gone 3 paces, a horrified howl that sounded ripped from her throat. The cloak flared as Elaine spun around, embracing the true source, feeling the richness of Sidar flowing through her. Elsie was standing on the strip of carpet that ran along the middle of the pale brown floor tiles, staring the other way down the hall with both hands pressed to her mouth. 2 crossing corridors opened in that direction, but there was not another soul in sight. "What is it, Elsie?" Elaine demanded. She had several weeds already on the edge of forming, ranging from a simple net of air to a fireball that would have demolished half the walls in front of her, and in her present humor she wanted to use one of them, to strike out with the power. Her moods were uncertain of late, to say the least. The girl looked back over one shoulder, trembling, and if her eyes had been wide before, they bulged now. Her hands remained clamped to her mouth as if to prevent another scream. Dark-haired and dark-eyed, tall and plump-bosomed in House Matherin's gray and blue livery, she was not really a girl. Elsie might be 4 or 5 years older than herself, but the way she behaved made it difficult to think of her any other way. "What is it, Elsie? And don't tell me it was nothing. You look as if you'd seen a ghost." The girl flinched. "I did," she said unsteadily. That she gave Elaine no title showed just how unsteady she was. "Lady Melaine, as was Lord Edmund's grandmother. She died when I was little, but I remember even Lord Edmund tiptoed around her temper, and the maids used to jump if she looked at them, and other ladies who visited too, and the lords as well. Everybody was afraid of her. She was right there in front of me, and she scowled so furious." She broke off, blushing, when Elaine laughed. It was more a laugh of relief than anything else. The Black Ajah had not somehow followed her to Lord Edmund's manor. There were no assassins waiting with knives in their fists, no sisters loyal to Elida wanting to whisk her back to Tar Valon. Sometimes she dreamed about those things, about all of them in the same dream. She released Sidon, reluctantly as always, regretful as that fullness of joy and life drained out of her. Matherin supported her, but Edmund might have taken it amiss if she had ruined half his home place. "The dead cannot harm the living, Elsie," she said gently. The more gently because she had laughed, not to mention wanting to box the ninny's ears. "They're not of this world any more, and they can't touch anything in it, including us." The girl nodded and dropped another curtsy, but by the size of her eyes and the trembling of her lips, she was unconvinced.
Elaine had no time to cosset her, though. "Fetch the men for my cases, Elsie," she said firmly, "and don't worry about ghosts." With yet another curtsy, the girl dashed off, her head swiveling anxiously in case the Lady Elaine leaped out of the paneled walls. Ghosts. The fool girl was a ninny. Matherin was an old house, if not large or strong, and the main stairs leading down to the entry hall were broad and trimmed with marble railings. The entry hall itself was a generous space, with gray and blue floor tiles and mirrored oil lamps hanging on chains from the ceiling 20 feet above. There was nothing in the way of gilding and little inlay, but ornately carved chests and cabinets stood along the sides of the hall, and two wall hangings were displayed on one wall. One showed men hunting leopards from horseback, a chancy business at best, and the other women of House Matherin presenting a sword to the first Queen of Andor, an event that Matherin treasured, and that might or might not have actually happened. Avienda was already down, pacing restlessly in the hall, and Elaine sighed at the sight. They would have shared a room, if not for the implication that Matherin could not provide adequately for two visitors of note. But Avienda did not really understand that the smaller the house, the loftier the pride. Often the smaller houses possessed little more. Pride she should have understood, since a fierce pride and strength all but shone from her. Straight-backed and even taller than Elaine, a thick dark shawl draped over her pale blouse, and a folded gray headscarf holding back her long reddish hair, she was the very picture of a wise one, despite being only a year older than Elaine. Wise ones who could channel often appeared to be much younger than they were, and Avienda had the dignity. At this moment she did anyway, though the pair of them had giggled together often enough. Of course, her only jewelry was a long silver Kandori necklace, an amber brooch in the shape of a turtle, and a wide ivory bracelet. And wise ones always wore festoons of necklaces and bracelets. But Avienda was not a wise one yet, merely an apprentice. Elaine never thought of Avienda as merely anything, but it did present problems now and then. Sometimes she thought the wise ones considered her an apprentice of some sort as well, or at least a student. A silly thought, to be sure, but sometimes. As Elaine reached the foot of the stairs, Avienda adjusted her shawl and asked, "Did you sleep well?" Her tone was untroubled, but anxiety nestled around her green eyes. "You did not send for wine to help you sleep, did you? I made sure your wine was watered when we ate, but I saw you looking at the wine pitcher." "Yes, Mother," Elaine said in a sickly sweet voice. "No, Mother. I was wondering how Evelyn got his hands on such a fine vintage, Mother. It was a shame to water it, and I drank the goat's milk before I went to sleep." If anything brought her to birthing sickness, it would be goat's milk. And to think she used to like it. Avienda planted her fists on her hips, such an embodiment of indignation that Elaine had to laugh. There were inconveniences to being with child, ranging from abrupt swings in her temper to tenderness in her breasts to always being tired, but the coddling was the worst in some ways. Everyone in the royal palace knew she was pregnant. A good many had known before she did, courtesy of Min's viewing and Min being too free with her tongue, and she did not think she could have been so muddled when she was an infant. Still, she put up with all the bother with as much grace as she could muster. Usually she did. They were only trying to be helpful. She just wished every woman she knew did not believe that pregnancy had made her brainless. Nearly every woman she knew. Those who had never borne a child themselves were the worst. Thinking of her baby, at times she wished Min had said whether it would be a boy or a girl, or rather that Avienda or Brigitta could recall exactly what Min actually had said. Min was always right, but the three of them had consumed a great deal of wine that night, and Min had been gone from the palace long before Elaine herself knew to ask. Thinking of the child growing in her always made her think of Rand, just as thinking of him made her think of the babe. One followed the other as surely as cream rose in the milk pan. She missed Rand terribly, and yet she could not miss him. A part of him, the sense of him, rode always in the back of her head, unless she masked the bond right alongside her sense of Brigitta, her other warder. The bond had its limits, however. He was
Hey,
somewhere to
Fire,
the
how you
west,
doing?
far enough that she could tell little more than that he was alive. Nothing more, really,
Yeah, I'm
though she thought she
on the
would know
floor
if he had been
today.
badly injured. She was not sure she wanted to know what he was up to. He had been far to the south for a long time after
Do
leaving
some
her,
extra
and
blankets down
now,
there.
just this morning,
See
he
if
had
that
traveled to the
helps.
west. It was disconcerting, really, to feel him in one direction and then suddenly have him off in another, even farther away. He could be pursuing
Scared.
enemies or running from enemies or any one of 1,000 things.
Stuff
She hoped very much it was something innocuous that made
put up
him
or
travel. He was going to die on her
at
all
least
too
get stuff
soon.
set up so we can
Men who
smoke a
could
little
channel
bit.
always died of it, but she wanted so very much to keep him alive as long as possible. He is well, Avienda said, almost as though she could read her mind. They had their own shared sense of one
Hopefully
another
I do.
since their mutual adoption as first sisters, but it did not go as far as the warder bond they and Min shared with Ram. If he allows himself to be killed, I will cut off his ears. Elaine blinked, then laughed again, and after a startled glance, Avienda joined in. It was not that funny, except maybe to an Aiel. Avienda's sense of humor was very odd. But Elaine could not stop laughing, and Avienda seemed as helpless. Shaking with mirth, they hugged one another and hung on. Life was very strange. Had anyone told her a few years ago that she would share a man with another woman, with two other women, she would have called them mad. The very idea would have been indecent. But she loved Avienda every bit as much as she did Rand, only in a different way, and Avienda loved Rand as much as she did.
My Chevy desk
Denying
would help
that
too much
meant
since I am in
denying
my
Avienda,
bedroom.
and she could as easily step out of her skin. Aiel women, sisters or close friends, often married the same man, and seldom gave him any say in the matter. She was going to marry Rand, and so was Avienda, and so was Min. Whatever anyone said or thought, that was all there was to it. If he lived long enough. Suddenly she became afraid that her laughter was edging toward tears. Please, Light, let her not be one of those women who became weepy when they were with child. It was bad enough not knowing whether she was going to be melancholy or furious from one minute to the next. Hours might pass when she felt perfectly normal, but then there were hours when she felt like a child's ball bouncing down an endless flight of stairs. This morning she seemed to be on the stairs. He is well, and he will be well, Avienda whispered fiercely, as if she intended to assure his survival by killing anything that threatened him. With the tips of her fingers, Elaine brushed a tear from her sister's cheek. He is well, and he will be well, she agreed softly. But they could not kill Saidin, and the taint on the male half of the power was what was going to kill him. The lamps overhead flickered as one of the tall doors to the outside opened, letting in a gust of air even colder than that in the entry hall, and they quickly moved a little apart, just holding hands. Elaine schooled her face to a serene smoothness fully worthy of an Aes Sedai. She could not afford to let anyone see her apparently seeking comfort in a hug. A ruler, or one who sought to rule, was not allowed the slightest suggestion of weakness or tears. Not in public. There were rumors enough about her as it was, as many bad as good. She was benevolent or cruel, fair-minded or arbitrary, generous or avaricious, all according to which tale you listened to. At least the tales balanced out one another, but anyone who could say they had actually seen the daughter heir huddling in the arms of her companion might add a tale of fear to the blend, and if her enemies believed she was afraid, they would only grow bolder and stronger. Cowardice was the sort of rumor that stuck like greasy mud. You could never wash it off completely. History recorded women who had lost their bids for the Lion Throne on no further discernible grounds. Capability was a requirement for a successful ruler, and wisdom was to be hoped for, though women lacking both had gained the throne and muddled through somehow. But few would support a coward, and none of those people she wanted on her side. The man who came in, turning to push the massive door shut behind him, had only one leg and used a crutch in place of the other. Even with fleece padding, the sleeve of his heavy woolen coat was worn from it. A heavy-shouldered former soldier, Fridwin Ross, managed Lord Edmund's estate, with the aid of a fat clerk who had blinked at the daughter heir in consternation, gaped at her great serpent ring with something near to awe, and scurried back to his ledgers in relief as soon as he realized she had no business with him. He had probably feared a levy on the manor's accounts. Master Ross had stared at her ring in amazement, to be sure, but he had grinned with delight at the daughter heir, and regretted that he could no longer ride for her with such sincerity that, had he been a liar, he would already have bilked Eadman and the clerk of everything they owned between them. She did not fear him carrying the wrong tales. His crutch made a rhythmic thump as he came up the hall, and he managed a credible bow in spite of it, including Avienda in his courtesy. He had been startled by her at first, but surprisingly quick to catch their friendship, and if he did not entirely trust in Aiel, it meant he accepted her. He could not ask for everything. "The men are strapping your cases to the pack animals, my queen, and your escort is ready." He was one of those who refused to call her anything except my queen or majesty, but a hint of doubt entered his voice at mention of her escort. He covered it hastily with a cough and hurried on. "The men we're sending with you are all mounted as well as I could manage. Young men, mainly, and a few more experienced, but they all know which end of a halberd has the point. I wish the manor could give you more, but I explained when Lord Eadman heard there were others claiming what's yours by right. He decided not to wait for spring, and he called in his armsmen and set out for Camelin. We've had a couple of bad snowfalls since, but he might be halfway there by now, with luck in the passes." His gaze carried conviction, but he knew better than she that with the wrong luck, Eadman and his armsmen might be dead in those passes. "Matherin has always maintained faith with Trakand," Elaine told him, "and I put my trust that it always will. I value Lord Eadman's loyalty, Master Ross, and yours." She did not insult Matherin and him by promising to remember or offering rewards, yet Master Ross's broad smile said she had already given him as much reward as he desired. Matherin would receive rewards if they were earned, but they could not be held out as if offering to buy a horse. Thumping along on his crutch, Master Ross bowed her to the door and bowed her out onto the broad granite step, where servants wearing heavy coats waited in the bitter cold with a stirrup cup of hot spiced wine that she rejected with a murmur. Until she had a chance to adjust to the sharp air, she wanted both hands to hold her cloak closed. Avienda would probably have found a way to make her drop it anyway. She took a cup, after wrapping her shawl around her head and shoulders, the only concession she made to the icy morning. She was ignoring the cold, of course. Elaine was the one who had taught her how.
That's definitely a good one.
Elaine tried again to push the cold away, and to her surprise, it receded. Not all the way. She still felt chilly, but it was better than freezing. The sky was clear, the sun bright as it sat over the mountains, but storm clouds could come boiling across the surrounding peaks at any time. It would be best to reach their first destination today as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, Fireheart, her tall black gelding, was living up to his name, rearing and snorting gouts of steamy breath as if he had never worn a bridle before. And Avienda's leggy, arch-necked gray had taken it into her head to imitate him, dancing in the knee-deep snow and trying to go anywhere except where the groom tried to lead her. She was a more spirited animal than Elaine would have chosen for her sister, yet Avienda herself had insisted after learning the mare's name. Siswai meant spear in the old tongue. The grooms seemed capable women, but they appeared to think they needed to calm the animals before handing them over. It was all Elaine could do not to snap at them that she had managed Fireheart before they ever saw him. Her escort was already mounted to avoid standing in the snow, 20-odd riders in the white-collared red coats and brightly burnished breastplates and helmets of the Queen's Guard. Master Ross's doubt might be explained by the
Right, the
fact that the
baldies.
riders' coats were silk, as were their red breeches with the white stripe up each
Then that
leg,
big old one,
and by the
terror.
pale lace they wore at neck and cuff. They certainly appeared more ceremonial than effective. Or it might have been that they were all women. Women were uncommon in jobs that required using weapons, just the occasional merchant's guard or a rare woman who turned up in an army during time of war. And Elaine had never heard of a group of all-female soldiers before she created one. Except the maidens, of course. But they were Aiel, and a different matter. She hoped people would think them an affectation on her part, and largely decorative with all the lace and silk. Men tended to underestimate a woman carrying weapons until they faced one, and even most other women tended to think her a brainless fool. Bodyguards usually tried to appear so ferocious that no one would dare trying to get past them, but her enemies would just find a new way to attack if she stood the whole Queen's Guard around her, shoulder to shoulder. A bodyguard her enemies would dismiss until it was too late for more than regrets was her aim. She intended to make their uniforms more elaborate, partly to feed those misconceptions, and partly to feed the women's pride as soldiers marked out from the rest. But she herself had no doubts. Every one of them, from merchants' guards to hunters of the Horn, had been carefully chosen for her skills, experience, and courage. She was ready to put her life in their hands. She already had. A lean woman wearing a lieutenant's 2 golden knots on the shoulder of her red cloak saluted Elaine with an arm across her chest, and her roan gelding tossed his head, making the silver bells in his mane chime faintly, as if he too were saluting. "We are ready, my lady, and the area is clear." Kasela Razkovny was one of those who had been a merchant's guard,
Oh yeah, I
and
remember
her
that. That's a good
Arafellan
one too.
accents were not those of an educated woman, but her voice was brisk and no
The
nonsense.
greasers and associates.
She used the proper form of address and would until Elaine was crowned, yet she was ready to fight to gain that crown for Elaine. Very, very few, male or female, signed the roster of the Queen's Guard these days unless they were ready for that. "The men Master Ross handed over are ready too, as ready as they'll ever be." Clearing his throat, the man shifted his crutch and took to studying the snow in front of his boots. Elaine could see what Kasela meant. Master Ross had scraped together 11 men from the manor to send to Camelin and outfitted them with halberds and short swords and what armor he could find, 9 antique helmets without face guards, and 7 breastplates with dents that made them vulnerable. Their mounts were not bad, though hairy with their winter coats. But even huddled as their riders were in thick cloaks, she could see that 8 were unlikely to need to shave above once in a week, if that. The men Master Ross had described as being experienced had wrinkled faces and bony hands, and probably not a full set of teeth between them. He had not been lying or trying to stint. Eastman would have gathered all the fit men in the area to take with him and outfitted them in the best he had. The story had been the same everywhere. Apparently a great number of hale and hearty men scattered the length of Andor were trying to reach her in Camelin, and none of them likely to get into the city until all was decided now. She could search every day without finding a single band. Still, this little bunch held their halberds as if they knew how to use them. Then again, that was not hard to do, sitting a saddle at rest with the halberd butt tucked in your chin. She could have managed that. "We have visited 19 of these now, sister," Avienda said softly, moving closer until their shoulders touched. "And counting these, we have gathered 205 boys too young and old men who should have left so long ago. I have not asked before. You know your people and your ways. Is this worth the time you give it?" "Oh, yes, sister." Elaine kept her voice just as low, so the one-legged former soldier and the servants could not overhear. The best of people could turn mule-headed if they realized you wanted them to behave a certain way. particularly if they realized that the help they had
That's
painfully
crazy.
gathered and offered and you had
Dabs
accepted
up.
was not what you were after at all. Everyone in that village down by the river knows how now, and so do half the farms for miles. By noon, the other half will know, and by tomorrow, the next
They
village
definitely don't
over
make
and
movies
more
like they
farms.
used to.
News travels slowly in winter, especially in this country. They know I've spoken my claim to the throne. Yet if I gain the throne tomorrow or die tomorrow, they might not learn of it before the middle of spring, maybe not even until summer. But today they know that Elaine Trakand is alive, that she visited the manor in silks and jewels, and summoned men to her banner. People 20 miles from here will claim they saw me and touched my hand. Few people can say that without speaking in favor of whoever they claim to have seen. And when you speak in favor of someone, you convince yourself to favor them. There are men and women in 19 places around Andor talking about how they saw the daughter heir just this last week. And every day the area that talk covers spreads like an ink blot. If I had time, I'd visit every village in Andor. It won't make a hair of difference in what happens in Camelin, but it may make all the
No
difference after I win. She would not admit to any possibility other than winning, especially not given who would take the throne if she failed. Most queens in our history spent the first years of their rule gathering the people solidly behind them, Avienda, and some never did. But harder times than these are coming. I may not have 1 year before I need every Andoran to stand behind me. I can't wait until I have the throne. Harder times are coming, and I have to be ready. Andor has to be ready, and I must make it so, she finished firmly. Smiling, Avienda touched Elaine's cheek. I think I will learn a great deal about being a wise one from you. To her mortification, Elaine blushed in embarrassment. Her cheeks felt on fire. Maybe the swings in humor were worse than the gossiping. Light. She had months of this to look forward to. Not for the first time, she found a kernel of resentment toward Rand. He had done this to her. All right, she had helped him. Instigated the doing, in fact, but that was beside the point. He had done this and walked away with a smug grin on his face. She doubted his grin had really been smug, but she could picture it all too easily. Let him dart from giddy to weepy every other hour and see how he liked it. He can't think in a straight line, she thought irritably. That was his fault, too. The grooms finally deemed Fireheart and Avienda's Siswai meek enough to be mounted by ladies, and Avienda climbed to her saddle from the stone mounting block with a good deal more grace than she once had shown, arranging her bulky, undivided skirts to cover as much of her dark-stockinged legs as possible. She still believed that her own legs were superior to any horse, yet she had become a passable rider, though she did have a tendency to look surprised when the horse did as she wanted. Fireheart tried to dance once Elaine was on his back, but she reined him in smartly, and a bit more sharply than she would have normally. Her teetering moods had taken her to a sudden sense of dread for Rand, and if she could not ensure his safety, there was one male at hand she could make certain did exactly as he was supposed to. 6 of the guardswomen led the way down the road from the manor at a slow walk, all the depth of snow would allow, with the rest following her and Avienda in smart columns, the last horsewomen in line leading the pack animals. The local men trailed behind raggedly with their own pack-horse, a shaggy creature tied about with cook-pots and rough bundles, and even half a dozen live chickens. A few cheers greeted them as they rode through the thatch-roofed village and across the stone bridge that crossed a snake-curved frozen stream. Loud cries of, Elaine of the Lily, and Trakand, Trakand, and Matherin stands. But she saw a woman crying on her husband's chest, and tears on his face too, and another woman who stood with her back to the riders and her head down, refusing even to look. Elaine hoped she would send their sons home to them. There should be little fighting at Camelin unless she blundered badly, but there would be some. And once the rose crown was hers, Battles lay ahead. To the south lay the Shan, and to the north Myrdral and Trollocs waiting to descend for Tarman Gaiden. Andor would bleed suns in the days to come. Burn her. She was not going to cry. Beyond the bridge, the road slanted up again, a steep climb through pine and fir and leatherleaf, but it was no more than a long mile to the mountain meadow they sought. The snow shining beneath the mid-morning sun still bore the marks of hooves, coming from where a gateway had left a deep furrow in the snow. It could have been nearer the manor, but the possibility of someone standing where your gateway opened was always the danger. The glow of Saidar surrounded Avienda as they rode into the meadow. She had made the gateway to come here from their last stop yesterday afternoon, the manor 100 miles north, so she would weave the gateway to go to Camelin, but the sight of Avienda shining with the power made Elaine go broody. Whoever made the gateway to leave Camelin always ended up making all the others until they returned, since she learned the ground at each place her gateway touched. But on each of their 5 trips, Avienda had asked to make that first gateway. She might simply have wanted the practice, as she claimed, though Elaine hardly had more practice than she did. But another possibility had come to mind. Maybe Avienda wanted to keep her from channeling, in any considerable amount at least, because she was pregnant. The weave that had made them sisters of the same mother could not have been used if either of them had been with child, because the unborn child would have shared in the bond, a thing it could not be strong enough to survive. But surely one of the Aes Sedai in the palace would have said something if channeling was to be avoided in pregnancy. Then again, very few Aes Sedai ever bore children. They might not know. She was aware there were many things Aes Sedai did not know, however much they might pretend otherwise to the rest of the world. She herself had taken advantage of that presumption from time to time, but it seemed very strange that they might be ignorant of something so important to most women. It was as though a bird knew how to eat every seed and grain except barley, so supposedly knew, because if it did not know how to eat barley, what else might it be ignorant of? Wise ones bore children, though, and they had said nothing about it. Abruptly, concerns over her babe and channeling and what Aes Sedai might or might not know were pushed right out of her head. She could feel someone channeling Saidar. Not Avienda, not someone on one of the surrounding mountains, not anyone near as close as that. This was distant, like a beacon blazing on a far mountain top in the night. A very distant mountain. She could not imagine how much of the one power was needed for her to feel channeling at that distance. Every woman in the world who could channel must be able to sense this, to point straight to it. And the beacon lay to the west. Nothing had changed in the bond with Rand. She could not have said exactly where he was within 100 miles, but she knew. "He's in danger," she said. "We must go to him, Avienda." Avienda gave herself a shake and stopped staring westward. The glow remained around her, and Elaine could feel that she had drawn on the source as deeply as she could. But even as Avienda turned to her, she felt the amount of Saidar the other woman held dwindle. "We must not, Elaine." Aghast, Elaine twisted in Fireheart's saddle to stare at her. "You want to abandon him? To that?" No one could handle so much of Saidar, not the strongest circle, not unaided. Supposedly a Sa'angreal existed greater than anything else ever made, and if what she had heard was correct, that might be able to handle this, maybe. But from what she had heard, no woman could use it and live, not without Turangreal made for the purpose, and no one had ever seen one that she knew of. Surely no sister would try, even if she had found one. That much of the one power could level mountain ranges at a stroke. No sister would try, except perhaps one of the Black Aja, or worse, one of the Forsaken, maybe more than one. What else could it be? And Avienda simply wanted to ignore it when she must know that Rand was there? The guardswomen, unaware, were still waiting patiently on their horses, keeping watch on the tree line around the meadow, and little concerned with that after their reception at the manor. though Casela was watching Elaine and Avienda, a slight frown visible behind the face bars of her helmet. She knew they never delayed at opening a gateway. The men from the manor were gathering around their pack horses, pawing at the bundles and apparently arguing over whether or not something had been included. Avienda still moved her gray closer to Elaine's black and spoke in a voice that would not carry. "We know nothing, Elaine. Not whether he is dancing the spears or this is something else. If he dances the spears and we rush in, will he attack us before he knows who we are? Will we distract him because he does not expect us and allow his enemies to win? If he dies, we will find who took his life and kill them. But if we go to him now, we go blindly, and we may bring disaster on our backs." "We could be careful," Elaine said sullenly. It infuriated her that she was feeling sullen and showing it, but all she could do was ride her moods and try not to let them get the upper hand completely. "We don't have to travel right to the spot." Gripping her pouch, feeling the small ivory carving of a seated woman that nestled inside, she looked pointedly at her sister's amber brooch. "Light, Avienda. We have Angreal, and neither of us is exactly helpless." Oh, Light. Now she was sounding petulant. She knew very well that both of them together, Angreal and all, would be flies battling a flame against what they could sense. But even so, a fly bite at the right moment might make the difference. "And don't tell me I'll endanger the baby. Min said she will be born strong and healthy. You told me so yourself. That means I will live at least long enough for my daughter to be born." She hoped for a daughter. Fireheart chose that moment to nip at the gray, and Siswai nipped back. And for a bit, Elaine was occupied with getting her gelding under control and keeping Avienda from being thrown, and telling Casela that they did not need any help. And by the end of it, she was not feeling sullen any longer. She wanted to smack Fireheart right between his ears. Aside from making the animal obey the reins, Avienda behaved as if nothing had happened at all. She did frown, a little uncertainly, her face framed by the dark wool of her shawl, but her uncertainty had nothing to do with the horse. "I have told you about the rings in Ruidian," she said slowly, and Elaine gave an impatient nod. Every woman who wanted to become a wise one was sent through a Turangreal before she began training. It was something like the Turangreal used to test novices for being raised to accepted in the White Tower, except that in this one, a woman saw her whole life. All of her possible lives, really, every decision made differently, an infinite fan of lives based on differing choices. No one can remember all of that, Elaine, only bits and pieces. I knew I would love Randall Thor. She was still uncomfortable sometimes about using just his first name in front of others. And that I would find sister wives.
All right, the
For most
orphans.
things, all you retain is a vague impression at best. A hint of warning sometimes. I think if we go to him now, something very bad will happen. Maybe one of us will die. Maybe both, in spite of what Min said. That she said Min's name without fumbling was a measure of her concern. She did not know Min very well, and usually named her formally as Min Farshaw. Perhaps he will die. Perhaps something else. I do not know for sure. Maybe we will all survive, and we will sit around a fire with him, toasting Pakara when we find him. But the glimmer of a warning is there in my head. Elaine opened her mouth angrily. Then she closed it again, anger draining away like water down a hole, and her shoulders slumped. Perhaps Avienda's glimmer was true, and perhaps not. But the fact was that her arguments had been good from the start.
I'll be right back.
A great risk taken in ignorance, and taking it might bring disaster. The beacon had grown brighter still, and he was there, right where the beacon was. The bond did not tell her so, not at this distance, but she knew. And she knew she had to leave him to take care of himself, while she took care of Andor.
It's gonna take me a second to get up.
"I don't have anything to teach you about being a wise one, Avienda," she said quietly. "You are already much wiser than I, not to mention braver and more cool-headed. We return to Kingland." Avienda colored faintly under the praise. She could be very sensitive at times. But she wasted no time in opening the gateway, a rotating view of a stable yard in the royal palace that widened into a hole in the air and let snow from the meadow fall onto the clean-swept paving stones as near 300 miles away as made no difference. The sense of Birgitta, somewhere in the palace, sprang alive in Elaine's head. Birgitta had a headache and a sour stomach. Not unusual occurrences of late, but they suited Elaine's mood all too well. I must leave him to take care of himself, she thought, as she rode through. Light. How often had she thought that? No matter. Rand was the love of her heart and the joy of her life, but Andor was her duty. Chapter 11. Talk of Debts. The gateway was positioned so that Elaine seemed to be riding out of a hole in the wall against the street into a square marked out for safety by sand-filled wine barrels standing on the paving stones. Oddly, she could not feel a single woman channeling anywhere in the palace, though it housed more than 150 with the ability. Some would be stationed on the city's outer walls, of course, too far for her to sense anything short of a linked circle, and a few would be out of the city altogether. Yet someone in the palace was almost always using Saidar, whether to try forcing one of the captive Suldam to admit that she really could see weaves of the One power, or simply to smooth the wrinkles from a shawl without heating an iron. Not this morning, though. Windfinder arrogance often matched the worst shown by any Aes Sedai, yet even that must be quashed by what they sensed. Elaine thought that if she climbed to a high window, she must be able to see the weaves of that great beacon, hundreds of leagues distant as they were. She felt like an ant that had just become aware of mountains, an ant comparing the spine of the world to the hills it had always held in awe. Yes, even the Windfinders must be walking small in the face of that. On the eastern side of the palace, and fronted on north and south by two-story-high stables of pure white stone, the Queen's stable yard traditionally was given over to the Queen's personal horses and carriages, and she had hesitated over using it before the Lion Throne was acknowledged hers. The steps that led to the throne were as delicate as any court dance, and if the dance sometimes came to resemble a tavern brawl, you still had to make your steps with grace and precision in order to gain your goal. Claiming the perquisites before being confirmed had cost some women their chance to rule. In the end, she had decided it was not a transgression that would make her seem overproud. Besides, the Queen's stable yard was relatively small and had no other use. There were fewer people to keep away from an opening gateway here. In fact, when she entered it, the stone-paved yard was empty, apart from a single red-coated groom standing in one of the arched stable doorways. But he turned to give a shout inside, and dozens more came spilling out as she guided Fireheart clear of the marked-off square. After all, she might have returned with an entourage of powerful lords or ladies, or perhaps they just hoped she had.
There's just a little bit of pain.
Casella brought the guardswomen through the gateway and ordered most to dismount and see to their animals. She and half a dozen more remained in their saddles, keeping watch over the heads of the people afoot. Even here she would not leave Elaine unguarded, particularly here, where she faced more danger than in any manor she had visited. The Matherin men milled about, getting in the way of grooms and guards while gaping at the white stone balconies and colonnades that overlooked the yard and the spires and golden domes visible
all I got
behind.
right now is
The cold seemed less here than in the mountains,
a couple
refusing
blankets,
to let it touch her,
just
as far
folded
as she
in
could at
half.
present, did not make her totally unaware. But men and women and horses all still breathed faint plumes of mist. The odor of horse dung seemed strong, too, after the clean air of the mountains. A hot bath in front of a roaring fire would be welcome. Afterward, she would have to plunge back into the business of securing the throne, but right now a long soak would be just the thing. A pair of grooms ran to Fireheart. One took his bridle with a hurried curtsy for Elaine, more concerned with seeing that the tall gelding made no bother while Elaine dismounted than with making courtesies herself, and another who made his bow and
Big
remained
old
bent
beanbag
with
chair.
his hands making
That'd
a
probably be
stirrup for
comfy
Elaine.
too.
Neither gave more than a glance at the view of a snow-covered mountain meadow where they would normally see a stone wall. The stable workers were accustomed to gateways by now. She had heard that they garnered drinks in the taverns by boasting of how often they saw the power used, and the things they supposedly had seen done with it. Elaine could imagine what those tales sounded like by the time they reached Aramilla. She rather enjoyed the thought of Aramilla chewing her fingernails. As she set foot on the paving stones, a cluster of guardswomen appeared around
Before
her,
I smoke
in
this,
crimson hats with white plumes lying flat on the broad brims, and lace-edged crimson sashes,
before I light this
embroidered with the
though,
white lion
let's
that
do another
slanted across
dab.
their bright breastplates. Not until then did Casella take the remainder of Elaine's escort to the stable. Their replacements were just as wary, eyes watching every direction, hands hovering near their sword hilts, except for Denny, a wide, placid-faced woman who carried a long brass-studded cudgel. They were only 9 in number. Only 9, Elaine thought bitterly. I need only 9 bodyguards in the royal palace itself. Yet everyone who carried a sword was expert. Women who followed the trade of the sword, as Casella called it, had to be good, or else sooner or later they were cut down by some fellow whose only advantage was strength enough to batter her down. Denny possessed no facility with the sword at all, but the few men who had tested her cudgel regretted doing so. Despite her bulk, Denny was very quick, and she had no concept of fighting fair, or of practice, for that matter. Rasuria, the stocky under-lieutenant in charge, seemed relieved when the grooms led Fireheart off. If Elaine's bodyguard had their way, no one except themselves would have been allowed within arm's reach. Well, maybe they were not quite that bad, but they looked with suspicion at almost everyone except Birgitta and Avienda. Rasuria, a tyrant despite her blue eyes and the yellow hair she wore cut short, was among the worst in this regard, even insisting on watching the cooks to make Elaine's meals, and having everything tasted before it was brought up. Elaine had not protested, however overzealous they might be. One experience of drugged wine was more than enough, even when she knew she would live at least long enough to bear her child. But it was neither the guardswoman's mistrust nor the joy that tightened her mouth. It was Birgitta, weaving her way through the crowded stable yard,
Cheers.
but not toward her. Avienda was last to appear out of the gateway, of course, after she was sure that everyone was through, and before she let the gateway wink out of existence, Elaine started in her direction, striding off so suddenly that her escort had to leap to maintain their guarding ring around her. As quickly as she moved, though, Birgitta, with her thick golden braid hanging to her waist, was there first, helping Avienda down and handing the gray mare over to a long-faced groom who seemed almost as leggy as Siswai. Avienda always had more difficulty getting off a horse than getting on, but Birgitta had more than assistance in mind. Elaine and her escort arrived just in time to hear the woman say to Avienda in a low, hurried voice, "Did she drink her goat's milk? Did she get enough sleep? She feels..." Her voice trailed off at the end, and she drew a deep breath before turning to face Elaine, outwardly calm and unsurprised to find her right there. The bond did work both ways. Birgitta was not a big woman, though she stood taller than Elaine in her heeled boots, as tall as Avienda. But she usually had a presence that was only heightened by the uniform of the Captain General of the Queen's Guards, a short red coat with a high white collar, worn over baggy blue trousers tucked into gleaming black boots, 4 golden knots on her left shoulder, and 4 bands of gold on each white cuff. After all, she was Birgitta Silverbow, a hero out of legend. She remained wary of trying to live up to those legends. She claimed that the stories were grossly inflated where they were not complete fabrications. Yet she was still the same woman who had done every one of the things that formed the heart of those legends, and more besides. Now, despite her apparent composure, unease tinged the concern for Elaine that flowed through the bond, along with her headache and her sullen stomach. She knew very well that Elaine hated for them to check on her behind her back. That was not the whole reason for Elaine's irritation, but the bond let Birgitta know just how upset she was. Avienda, calmly unwrapping her shawl from around her head and draping it over her shoulders, attempted the gaze of a woman who had done nothing wrong, and certainly was not involved with anyone else who had done anything wrong. She might have managed it if she had not widened her eyes for an added touch of innocence. Birgitta was a bad influence on her in some ways. I drank the goat's milk, Elaine said in a level voice, all too conscious of the guardswomen ringing the three of them. Facing outward, eyes scanning the yard and the balconies and the rooftops, nearly every one was certainly listening. I got enough sleep. Is there anything else you want to ask me? Avienda's cheeks colored faintly. I think I have all the answers I need for the moment, Birgitta replied, without a hint of the blush Elaine had been hoping for. The woman knew she was tired, knew she had to be lying about the sleep. The bond was decidedly inconvenient at times. She had drunk nothing but half a cup of extremely well-watered wine last night, but she was beginning to have Birgitta's morning after head and her sour stomach. None of the other Aes Sedai she had spoken to about the bond had mentioned anything of the kind, but she and Birgitta all too often mirrored one another, physically and emotionally. The last presented real problems when her moods were on a seesaw. Sometimes she managed to shrug it off or fight it off, but today she knew she was going to have to suffer until Birgitta was healed. She thought the mirroring must occur because they were both women. No one had heard of anyone bonding another woman before. Few had heard of it now, to tell the truth, and some of them seemed to believe it could not be true. A warder was male as surely as a bull was male. Everyone knew that, and not many stopped to think that anything that everyone knew deserved close examination. Being caught in a lie when she was trying to follow Egwene's dictate about living as if she had already taken the 3 oaths made Elaine defensive, and that made her blunt. Is Dylan back? No, Birgitta said just as bluntly, and Elaine sighed. Dylan had left the city days before Aramilla's army appeared, taking Rihanna Corley with her to make gateways and speed her travel, and a great deal depended on Dylan's return. On what news she brought back, on whether she brought anything besides news. Choosing who would be Queen of Andor was quite simple, boiled down to essentials. There were over 400 houses in the realm, but only 19 strong enough that others would follow where they led. Usually all 19 stood behind the daughter heir, or most of them, unless she was plainly incompetent. House Mantiar had lost the throne to Trakand when Mordrellin died, only because Tigraine, the daughter heir, had vanished, and Mantiar had begun running heavily to boy children, and because Morghese Trakand had gathered 13 houses in her support. Only 10 of the 19 were necessary to ascend the throne by law and custom. Even claimants who still thought they should have the throne themselves usually fell in with the rest, or at least fell silent and gave up their pursuit, once another woman had 10 houses at her back. Things had been bad enough when she had 3 declared rivals, but now Nayan and Elenia were united behind Aramilla Marn, of all people, the least likely of the 3 to have succeeded. And that meant she had 2 houses, 2 large enough to count. Mathurin and those 18 others she had visited were too small, her own Trakand and Dyalan's Taravin to face 6. Oh, Dyalan insisted that Karand, Koalan, and Renshar would come to Elaine, and Norwellin and Pendar and Tremaine besides. But the first 3 wanted Dyalan herself on the throne, and the last 3 seemed to have gone into hibernation. Dyalan was firm in her loyalty, though, and tireless on Elaine's behalf. She persisted in her belief that some of the houses that were keeping silent could be convinced to support Elaine. Of course, Elaine could not approach them herself, but Dyalan could. And now the situation verged on desperate. 6 houses supporting Aramilla, and only a fool would think she had not sent feelers out toward the others. Or that some might listen just because she did have 6 already. Despite the fact that Kassela and her guards had vacated the courtyard, Elaine and the others had to thread their way across the paving stones through a crowd. The men from Matherin were finally down off their horses, but they were still moiling about, dropping their halberds and picking them up only to drop them again, trying to unload their pack horse there in the stable yard. One of the boys was chasing a chicken that somehow had gotten loose and was scuttling between the horse's legs, while one of the wrinkled old men shouted encouragement, though whether for the boy or the chicken was unclear. A leather-faced bannerman with the merest fringe of white hair remaining in a faded red coat that strained across his belly was trying to establish order with the help of an only slightly younger guardsman, both of them likely returned from their pensions, as a good many had, but another of the boys seemed about to lead his shaggy horse into the palace itself, and Birgitta had to order him out of the way before Elaine could enter. The boy, a fuzz-cheeked lad who could not have been above 14, gaped at Birgitta as widely as he had at the palace. She was certainly more picturesque in her uniform than the daughter heir in a riding dress, and he'd already seen the daughter heir. Rasoria gave him a shove back toward the old bannerman, shaking her head. I don't flaming know what I can do with them, Birgitta grumbled, as a maid liveried in red and white took Elaine's cloak and gloves in the small entry hall. Small in terms of the royal palace. With gilded stand lamps flickering between narrow, fluted white columns, it was half again the size of Matherin's main entry hall, though the ceiling was not so high. Another maid with the white line on the left breast of her dress, a girl not that much older than the boy who had tried to bring his horse inside, offered a ropework silver tray with tall cups of steaming spiced wine, before simultaneous frowns from Avienda and Birgitta made her shy back. The flaming boys fall asleep if they're put on guard, Birgitta went on, scowling at the retreating maid. The old men stay awake, but half can't remember what they're flaming supposed to do if they see somebody trying to scale the bloody wall, and the other half together couldn't fight off 6 shepherds with a dog. Avienda raised an eyebrow at Elaine and nodded. They aren't here to fight, Elaine reminded them, as they started down a blue-tiled corridor, lined with mirrored stand lamps and inlaid chests. Birgitta and Avienda on either side of her, and the guardswomen spreading out a few paces ahead of them and behind. Light, she thought. I wouldn't have taken the wine. Her head pounded in rhythm with Birgitta's, and she touched her temple, wondering whether she should order her warder to go find healing immediately. Birgitta had other ideas, though. She eyed Rasoria and the others in front, then looked over her shoulder and motioned those following to fall back a little more. That was strange. She had handpicked every last woman in the guards, and she trusted them. Even so, when she spoke, it was in a hurried, near whisper, bending her head close to Elaine. Something happened just before your return. I was asking Sumiko if she'd heal me before you got back, and she suddenly fell over in a faint. Her eyes just rolled up in her head, and down she went. It isn't only her. Nobody will admit a flaming thing, not to me, but the other kin I've seen have been jumping out of their bloody skins, and the Windfinders too. Not one of them could spit if she had to. You were back before I could find a sister, but I suspect they'd give me the fisheye too. They'll tell you, though. The palace required the population of a large village to keep running, and servants had begun to appear, liveried men and women scurrying along the corridors, flattening themselves against the wall or ducking into crossing hallways to make room for Elaine's escort, so she explained the little she knew in as soft a voice and as few words as possible. Some rumors she did not mind reaching the streets and inevitably Aramilla, but tales of Rand could be as bad as tales of the Forsaken by the time they were twisted through a few retellings. Worse in a way. No one would believe the Forsaken were trying to put her on the throne as a puppet. In any event, she finished, it's nothing to do with us here. She thought she sounded very convincing, very cool and detached, but Avienda reached out to squeeze her hand, for an Aiel as much as a comforting hug with so many people to see, and Birgitta's sympathy flooded through the bond. It was more than commiseration. It was the shared feeling of a woman who had already suffered the loss she herself feared, and more. Guidal Kane was lost to Birgitta as surely as if he were dead, And on top of that, her memories of her past lives were fading. She remembered almost nothing clearly before the founding of the White Tower, and not all of that. Some nights the fear that Guidal would fade from her memory too, that she would lose any remembrance of actually having known and loved him, left her unable to sleep until she drank as much brandy as she could hold. That was a poor solution, and Elaine wished she could offer a better. Yet she knew her own memories of Rand would not die until she did, and she could not imagine the horror of knowing those memories might leave her. Still, she hoped someone healed Birgitta's morning after head soon before her own split open like an overripe melon. Her ability with healing fell short of the task, and Avienda's was no stronger. Despite the emotion she could feel in Birgitta, the other woman kept her face smooth and unconcerned. The Forsaken, she muttered dryly, and softly. That was not a name to bandy about. Well, as long as it has nothing to do with us, we're bloody all right. A grunt that might have been a laugh gave her the lie. But then, although Birgitta said she had never been a soldier before, she had a soldier's view. Long odds were usually the only odds you could find, but you still had to get the job done. I wonder what they think of it, she added, nodding toward the four Aes Sedai who had just stepped out of a crossing corridor down the hallway. Vandine, Marililla, Saritha, and Cariana had their heads together as they walked. Or rather, the last three were clustered around Vandine, leaning toward her and talking with urgent gestures that made the fringes on their shawls sway. Vandine glided along slowly as if she were alone, paying no heed. She'd always been slender, but her dark green dress, embroidered with flowers on the sleeves and shoulders, hung on her as though made for a stouter woman, and the white hair gathered at the nape of her neck seemed in need of a brush. Her expression was bleak, but that might have had nothing to do with whatever the other sisters were saying. She had been joyless ever since her sister's murder. Elaine would have wagered that dress had belonged to Adelius. Since the murder, Vandine wore her sister's clothes more often than her own. Not that hurt her a bit. The two women had been of a size, but Vandine's appetite for food had died with her sister. Her taste for most things seemed to have died then. Saritha, a brown whose dark, square face was not yet touched with agelessness, saw Elaine just then and put a hand on Vandine's arm as if to draw her up the corridor. Vandine brushed the Tyran woman's hand away and glided on with the merest glance at Elaine, disappearing on along the hallway they had come out of. Two women in novice white, who had been following the others at a respectful distance, offered quick curtsies to the remaining sisters and hastened after Vandine. Marililla, a tiny woman in dark gray that made her Kyrianan paleness seem like ivory, stared as if she might follow. Ariana adjusted her green-fringed shawl on shoulders wider than those of many men and exchanged quiet words with Saritha. The pair of them turned to meet Elaine as she approached, making her curtsies almost as deep as the novices had given them. Marililla noticed the guardswomen and blinked, then noticed Elaine and gave a start. Her curtsy matched the novices. Marililla had worn the shawl for over 100 years, Ariana for more than 50, and even Saritha had worn it longer than Elaine Tracan. But standing among Aes Sedai went with strength in the power, and none of these three was more than middling strong among sisters. In Aes Sedai eyes, increased strength gave, if not increased wisdom, at least increased weight to your opinions. With a sufficient gap, those opinions became commands. Sometimes Elaine thought the King was better. I don't know what it is, she said, before any of the other Aes Sedai could speak. But there is nothing we can do about it, so we might as well quit worrying. We have enough right in front of us without fretting over things we can't affect. Rosaria half turned her head, frowning and plainly wondering what she had missed. But the words smoothed the anxiety from Saritha's dark eyes. Perhaps not from the rest of her, since her hands moved as if she wanted to smooth her brown skirts. Yet she was willing to follow the lead of a sister who stood as high as Elaine. Sometimes there were advantages to standing high enough that you could quell objections with a sentence. Haryana had already regained serenity, if she had ever lost it. It sat easily on her, though she looked more like a wagon driver than an Aes Sedai, despite her barrel-slashed silks and smooth, ageless, coppery face. But then, greens usually were made of tougher stuff than browns. Marililla did not look at all serene. Wide eyes and half-parted lips gave her the appearance of startlement. That was usual for her, though. Elaine continued along the hallway, hoping they would go about their business, but Marililla fell in beside Brigitte. The Grey should have taken primacy among the three, but she had developed a tendency to wait for someone to tell her what to do, and she shifted over without a word when Saritha politely asked her to give her room. The sisters were unfailingly courteous to Elaine's warder when she was acting as Captain General. It was Brigitte as warder they tried to ignore. Avienda received no such civility from Cariana, who elbowed in between her and Elaine. Anyone not trained in the White Tower was a wilder by definition, and Cariana despised wilders. Avienda pursed her lips, though she did not draw her belt knife or even suggest that she might, for which Elaine was grateful. Her first sister could be precipitate at times. On second thought, she would have forgiven a little hastiness from Avienda right then. Custom forbade rudeness toward another Aes Sedai under any circumstances, but Avienda could have growled threats and waved her knife to her heart's content. That might have been enough to make the threesome leave, even if in a tizzy. Cariana did not seem to notice the cool green gaze marking her. I told Marililla and Saritha it was nothing we could do anything about, she said calmly. But shouldn't we be ready to flee if it comes closer? There's no shame flying from that. Even linked, we would be moths fighting a forest fire. Van Deen wouldn't bother to listen. We really should make preparations, Elaine, Saritha murmured absently, as if making lists in her head. It's when you don't make plans that you wish you had. There are a number of volumes in the library here that mustn't be left behind. I believe several can be found in the Tower Library. Yes. Marililla's voice was breathless, and as anxious as her large, dark eyes. Yes, we really should be ready to go. Perhaps we should not wait. Surely going from necessity would not violate our agreement. I am sure it would not. Only Brigitte as much as glanced at her, but she flinched. If we do go, Cariana said, as if Marililla had not spoken, we'll have to take all of the kin with us. Allow them to scatter, and the light only knows what they'll do or when we will ever catch them again, especially now that some have learned to travel. There was no bitterness in her voice, though only Elaine among the sisters in the palace could travel. It seemed to make a difference to Cariana that the kinswomen had begun in the White Tower, even if most had been put out and a few had run away. She had identified no fewer than 4 of them herself, including one runaway. At least they were not wilders. Saritha's mouth tightened, though. It weighed on her that several kinswomen could weave gateways, and she had very different notions of the kin. Normally she limited her objections to the occasional frown or disparaging grimace, since Elaine had made her own views clear, but the stress of the morning seemed to have loosened her tongue. We do indeed need to take them with us, she said in a cutting tone, else they'll all be claiming to be Aes Sedai as soon as they're out of our sight. Any woman who maintains she was put out of the tower over 300 years ago will claim anything. They need to be kept under a close watch, if you ask me, instead of going about as they please, most especially those who can travel. They may have gone where you told them and come back so far, Elaine, but how long before one of them doesn't return? Mark my words. Once one of them escapes, others will follow, and we will have a mess on our hands we'll never clean up. There is no reason for us to go anywhere, Elaine said firmly, as much for the guards as for their sisters. That distant beacon was still in the same spot where she had first sensed it, and if it did move, the chance seemed small that it would move toward Camelin, much less actually come there. But a rumor that Aes Sedai were planning flight might be enough to engender a stampede, mobs clawing to reach the gates ahead of whatever could frighten Aes Sedai. An army sacking the city would not kill as many. and these three chattered away as if there were no one to hear but the wall hangings. There was some excuse for Marillilla, but not the others. We will remain here as the Amerlin seat has commanded until the Amerlin commands otherwise. The kinswomen will continue to receive every courtesy until they are welcomed back into the tower, and that is the Amerlin's command too, as you very well know. And you will continue teaching the Windfinders and go about your lives as Aes Sedai should. We are supposed to deal with people's fears and soothe them, not spread senseless gossip and panic. Well, perhaps she had been a touch more than firm. Saritha put her gaze on the floor tiles like a rebuked novice. Marillilla flinched again at the mention of the Windfinders, but that was to be expected. The others gave lessons, but the sea folk held Marillilla as tightly as they did one of their apprentices. She slept in their quarters and normally was not seen without 2 or 3 of them, and her trailing meekly at their heels. They refused to accept anything less than meekness from her. "Of course, Elaine," Cariana said hastily. "Of course. None of us would suggest disobeying the Amerlin." Hesitating, she adjusted her green-fringed shawl over her arms, seemingly occupied with setting it just so. She did spare a pitying look for Marillilla. "But speaking of the sea folk, could you tell Van Deen to take her share of the lessons?" When Elaine said nothing, her voice took on an edge that would have been called sullen in anyone not Aes Sedai. "She says she's too busy with those 2 runaways, but she finds enough time to keep me talking some nights until I'm half asleep. That pair is already so cowed they wouldn't squeak if their dresses caught fire. They don't need her attention. She could take her portion of teaching those cursed Wilders. Van Deen needs to start behaving as an Aes Sedai, too." Standing or no, rebuke or no, she gave Elaine a baleful glare that took her a moment to smother. Elaine had been the one who made the bargain that led to Aes Sedai having to teach Windfinders, but so far she herself had managed to miss giving more than a handful of lessons, claiming the press of other more important duties. Besides, the sea folk saw a shore-bound teacher as a hireling, even an Aes Sedai, and a hireling with less standing than a scullion at that. A scullion who might try to cheat on her neighbor. She still thought Nynaeve had gone away just to avoid giving those lessons. Certainly no one expected to end up in Marililla's state, but even a few hours at a time was bad enough. "Oh no, Cariana," Saritha put in, still avoiding Elaine's eye, and Marililla's. In her opinion, the Grey had gotten herself into this fix and thus deserved what came of it, but she did try not to rub salt in the wounds. "Van Deen is distraught over her sister, and Christian and Zarya help her occupy her mind." Whatever she thought of the other kin, she accepted that Zarya was a runaway, as she had to, since Zarya was one of those Cariana had recognized, and if Christian must be a liar, her own lie would make her pay in full for that. Runaways were not treated kindly. I spend hours with her, too, and she almost never talks of anything but Adelius. It's as if she wants to add my memories to her own. I think she needs to be allowed as much time as she needs, and those 2 keep her from being alone too often." Giving Elaine a sidelong glance, she drew breath. Still, teaching the Windfinders is certainly challenging. Perhaps an hour now and then would help pull her out of despondency, if only by making her angry. Don't you agree, Elaine? Just an hour or 2 now and then? "Van Deen will be allowed as much time to grieve for her sister as she needs or wants," Elaine said in level tones, "and there will be no more discussion of it." Cariana sighed heavily and rearranged her shawl again. Saritha sighed faintly and began twisting the great serpent ring on the forefinger of her left hand. Perhaps they had sensed her mood, or perhaps it was just that neither looked forward to another session with the Windfinders. Marililla's permanently surprised expression did not change, but then her sessions with the sea folk lasted all day and all night, unless Elaine managed to pry her away, and the Windfinders were becoming less and less willing to let her go, no matter how Elaine pried. At least she had managed to avoid being curt with the 3. It took an effort, especially with Avienda there. Elaine did not know what she would do if she ever lost her sister. Van Deen was not only grieving for a sister, she was searching for Adelius's murderer, and there could be no doubt that the killer was Marililla Cian Devon, Cariana Franci, or Saritha Tomaras. One of them, or worse, more than one. The charge was hard to believe of Marililla in her present condition, but it was not easy to believe of any sister. As Birgitta had pointed out, one of the worst dark friends she had ever met during the Trolloc Wars was a mild-as-milk lad who jumped at loud noises and poisoned an entire city's water supply. Avienda's suggestion was to put all three to the question, which had horrified Birgitta, but Avienda was considerably less in awe of Aes Sedai than she once had been. The proper courtesies must be maintained until there was evidence to convict. Then there would be no courtesy at all. "Oh," Saritha said, brightening suddenly. "Here's Captain Mellar. He was a hero again while you were gone, Elaine." Avienda gripped the hilt of her belt knife, and Birgitta stiffened. Cariana's face went very still, very cold, and even Marililla managed a disapproving hauteur. Neither sister made any secret of her dislike for Doylan Mellar. With a narrow face, he was not pretty or even handsome, yet he moved with a swordsman's lithe grace that spoke of physical strength. As captain of Elaine's bodyguard, he rated 3 golden knots of rank, and he wore them soldered to each shoulder of his brightly burnished breastplate. An ignorant observer might have thought he outranked Birgitta. The falls of snow-white lace at his throat and wrists were twice as thick and twice as long as those worn by any of the guardsmen, but he had left off the sash again, perhaps because it would have obscured one set of golden knots. He claimed that he wanted nothing more in life than to command her bodyguard, yet he frequently talked of battles he had fought as a mercenary. It seemed he had never been on the losing side, and victory had often come from his unsung efforts on the field. He swept off his white-plumed hat in a deep, flourishing bow, managing his sword with one hand, then offered a slight visit to Birgitta, with an arm across his chest in salute. Elaine arranged a smile on her face. "Saritha says you were a hero again, Captain Mellar. How so?" "Nothing more than my duty to my queen." Despite a voice thick with self-deprecation, his answering smile was warmer than it should have been. Half the palace thought him the father of Elaine's child. That she had not crushed that rumor seemed to make him believe he had prospects. The smile never reached his dark eyes, though. They remained as cold as death. "My duty to you is my pleasure, my queen." "Captain Mellar led another sortie without orders yesterday," Birgitta said in a carefully even voice. This time the fighting almost spilled into the Farmadding gate, which he had ordered left open against his return. Elaine felt her face growing hard. "Oh no," Saritha protested. "It wasn't like that at all. 100 of Lord Luan's armsmen tried to reach the city in the night, but they left it too late, and sunrise caught them. So did 3 times their number of Lord Nason's men. If Captain Mellar hadn't opened the gates and led a rescue, they'd have been cut to pieces inside of the walls. As it was, he managed to save 80 for your cause." Smiling, Mellar basked in the Aes Sedai's praise as if he had not heard Birgitta's criticism. Of course, he seemed unaware of Cariana and Marililla's disapproving stares, too. He always managed to ignore disapproval. "How did you know they were Lord Luan's men, Captain?" Elaine asked quietly. A small smile that should have given Mellar warning appeared on Birgitta's face. But then he was one of those who seemed not to believe she was a warder. Even if he did, few except warders and Aes Sedai knew what the bond entailed. If anything, Mellar's expression grew more smug. "I didn't go by banners, my queen. Anybody can carry a banner. I recognized Jurad Akan through my looking glass. Akan is Luan's man to his toenails. Once I knew that," he made a dismissive gesture in a flurry of lace. "The rest was no more than taking a little exercise." "And did this Jurad Akan bring any message from Lord Luan? Anything signed and sealed affirming House Norwellan's support for Trakan?" Nothing in writing, my queen, but as I said, Lord Luan has not declared for me, Captain. Millar's smile faded somewhat. He was unused to being cut short. But, my queen, Lady Dialand says that Luan is as good as in your camp right now. Akan showing up is proof of nothing, Captain, Elaine said coldly. Perhaps Lord Luan will be in my camp eventually, Captain, but until he declares, you've given me 80 men who need to be watched. 80 out of 100. And how many of hers have he lost? And he had risked Camelin doing it, burn him. Since you can find time in your duties commanding my bodyguard to lead sorties, you can find time to arrange for watching them. I won't spare anyone from the walls for it. Set Master Akan and his fellows to drilling the men I've brought in from the manors. That will keep them all busy and out of trouble most of each day, but I leave it to you how to keep them away from the walls the rest of the time. And I do expect them kept away from the walls and out of trouble, Captain. You may see to it now. Millar stared at her slowly. She had never taken him to task before, and he did not like it, particularly in front of so many witnesses. There were no overwarm smiles now. His mouth twitched, and a sullen heat grew in his eyes. But there was nothing for him to do except to jerk another bow, murmur, "As my queen commands," in a hoarse voice, and leave with as good a grace as he could muster. Before he had gone 3 paces, he was striding down the hall as if to trample anyone who got in his way. She would have to tell Rosaria to take care. He might try to soothe his bile by taking it out on those who had seen and heard. Marililla and Cariana gave almost identical nods. They would have seen Millar called down and preferably put out of the palace long since. Even if he did wrong, Sarita said carefully, and I'm not convinced that he did. Captain Millar saved your life, at risk to his own, Elaine, your life and that of the Lady Dialand. Was there really need to embarrass him in front of the rest of us? Never think I avoid paying my debts, Sarita. Elaine felt Avienda grip one of her hands and Birgitta the other. She gave each of them a light squeeze. When you were surrounded by enemies, it was good to have a sister and a friend close by. I'm going to find a hot bath now, and unless one of you wishes to scrub my back. They could recognize a dismissal, and they departed more gracefully than Captain Millar, Cariana and Sarita already discussing whether or not the Windfinders would actually want lessons today, Marililla trying to look every direction at once, in hope of avoiding any Windfinders. What would they talk of later, though? Whether Elaine was having a spat with the father of her child? Whether they had successfully hidden their guilt in killing Adelius? I always pay my debts, Elaine thought, watching them go. And I help my friends pay theirs. Chapter 12. A Bargain. A bath was not hard to find, though Elaine had to wait in the hall frowning at the lion-carved doors of her apartments, drafts flickering the mirrored stand lamps, while Rosaria and 2 of the guardswomen went in to search. Once they were sure there were no assassins lying in wait, and guards had been arrayed in the corridor and outer room, Elaine entered to find white-haired Asunda waiting in the bedchamber with Naris and Sethany, the 2 young tirewomen she was training. Asunda was slim, with Elaine's golden lily embroidered over her left breast, and a very great dignity emphasized by her deliberate way of moving, though some of that came from age and aching joints she refused to acknowledge. Naris and Sethany were sisters, fresh-faced, sturdy, and shy-eyed, proud of their livery and happy to have been chosen out for this rather than cleaning hallways, but almost as much in awe of Asunda as of Elaine. There were more experienced maids available, women who had worked years in the palace, but sadly, girls who had come seeking any sort of work they could find were safer. 2 copper bathtubs sat on thick layers of toweling laid atop the rose-colored floor tiles where one of the carpets had been rolled up. Evidence that word of Elaine's arrival had flown ahead of her. Servants had a knack for learning what was happening that the tower's eyes and ears might envy. A good blaze in the fireplace and tight casements in the windows made the room warm after the corridors, and Asunda waited only to see Elaine enter the room before sending Sethany off at a run to fetch the men with the hot water. That would be brought up in double-walled pails with lids to keep it from getting cold on the way from the kitchens, though it might be delayed a little by guardswomen checking to make sure there were no knives hidden in the water. Avienda eyed the second bathtub almost as doubtfully as Asunda eyed Birgitta, the one still uneasy about actually stepping into water, and the other still not accepting that anyone more than necessary should be present during a bath. But the white-haired woman wasted no time before quietly bustling Elaine and Avienda both into the dressing room, where another fire on a wide marble hearth had taken the chill from the air. It was a great relief to have Asunda to help her out of her riding clothes, knowing that she had more ahead of her than a hasty wash and a show of ease, while worrying about how quickly she could move on to her next destination. Other pretenses awaited the light helper, and other worries, but she was home, and that counted for much. She could almost forget about that beacon shining in the west. Almost. Well, not at all, really, but she could manage to stop fretting over it as long as she did not dwell on the thing. By the time they had been undressed, with Avienda slapping Naris's hands away and removing her own jewelry, doing her best to pretend that Naris did not exist, and her garments were somehow removing themselves. By the time they had been bundled into embroidered silk robes and had their hair tied up in white toweling, Avienda tried to wrap the towel around her own head 3 times, and only after the construction collapsed down her neck for the 3rd time did she allow Naris to do it, muttering about getting so soft that she soon would need someone to lace up her boots, until Elaine began laughing and she joined in, throwing her head back so that Naris had to start over again. By the time all that was done, and they had returned to the bedchamber, the bathtubs were full, and the scent of the rose oil that had been added to the water filled the air. The men who had brought up the water were gone, of course, and Stephanie was waiting with her sleeves pushed above her elbows in case someone wanted her back scrubbed. Birgitta was sitting on the turquoise inlaid chest at the foot of the bed, her elbows on her knees. Elaine allowed Asunda to help her off with her pale green swallow-worked robe and sank into her tub immediately, submerging herself to her neck in water just a hair short of too hot. That left her knees poking up, but it immersed most of her in the warmth, and she sighed, feeling weariness leach out of her and languor creep in. Hot water might have been the greatest single gift of civilization. Staring at the other tub, Avienda gave a start when Naris attempted to remove her robe, lavender and embroidered with flowers on the wide sleeves. Grimacing, she finally allowed it and stepped gingerly into the water, but she snatched the round soap out of Stephanie's hand and began washing herself vigorously. Vigorously, but very careful not to slop so much as a spoonful of water over the tub's rim. The Aiel did use water for washing, as well as in the sweat tents, especially for rinsing out the shampoo they made from a fat leaf that grew in the waste. Yet the dirty water was conserved and used for watering crops. Elaine had shown her 2 of the great cisterns beneath Camelin, fed by a pair of underground rivers, and large enough that the far side of each was lost in a forest of thick columns and shadows. But the arid waste was in Avienda's bones. Ignoring Asunda's pointed looks, she seldom said 2 words more than necessary, and thought baths no time to say anything. Birgitta talked while they bathed, though she took care of what she said in front of Naris and Stephanie. It was unlikely they were in the pay of another house, but maids gossiped almost as freely as men. It seemed almost a tradition. Some rumors were worth fostering, nonetheless. Mostly, Birgitta talked of 2 huge merchants' trains that had arrived yesterday from Tyr, the wagons heavy with grain and salted beef, and another from Ilion with oil and salt and smoked fish. It was always worthwhile reminding people that food continued to flow into the city. Few merchants braved the roads of Andor in winter, none carrying anything as cheap as food. But gateways meant that Aranella could intercept all the merchants she wished, and her forces still would starve long before Camelin felt the first pangs of hunger. The Windfinders, who were making most of those gateways,
If you have to
reported
try
that
to
the
get more
High Lord
blankets stacked
Darlin,
up here.
claiming the title of Steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn of all things, was besieged in the Stone of Tyr by nobles who wanted the Dragon Reborn out of Tyr completely. But even they were unlikely to try stopping a rich trade in grain, particularly since they believed the kin who accompanied the Windfinders were Aes Sedai. Not that any real attempt was made at deception, but great serpent rings had been made for kinswomen who had passed their tests or accepted before being put out of the tower, and if anyone drew the wrong conclusion, no one actually lied to them. The water was going to shed its heat if she waited much longer, Elaine decided, so she took a rose-scented soap from Stephanie and allowed Nerys to begin scrubbing her back with a long-handled brush. If there had been news of Gawain or
Yeah,
Galad,
it
Birgitta would have
sucks,
mentioned
but
it straight off. She was as eager to hear as Elaine, and she could not have held it back. Gawain's return was one rumor that dearly wanted to reach the streets. Birgitta performed her duties well as Captain General, and Elaine meant her to keep the position if she could be convinced.
it
But
sucks,
having
but
Gawain there would allow both women to relax a little.
I gotta do my life
Most of the
still,
soldiers
so
in the city were mercenaries,
it'll
and
be
only
alright,
enough
I
of them to
guess.
man the gates strongly and make a display along the miles of wall surrounding the new city, but they still numbered more than 30 companies, each with its own captain, who
Something
inevitably was
eventually
full of
come
pride,
around.
obsessed with precedence, and ready to squabble over any imagined slight from another captain at the drop of a straw. Gawain had trained his whole life to command armies. He could deal with the squabblers, leaving her free to secure the throne. Apart from that, she simply wanted him away from the White Tower. She prayed that one of her messengers had gotten through and that he was well downriver by this time. Egwene had been besieging Tar Valon with her army for more than a week now, and it would be the cruelest spinning of fate for Gawain to be caught between his oaths to defend the tower and his love for Egwene. Worse, he had already broken that
It's all
oath
good.
once,
I'll
or at least
still do
bent
my
it, for love of
my
his sister,
my
and perhaps his
bookworms.
love of Egwene. If Elida ever
Even
suspected
if I
that
gotta sit
Gawain
on
had
the
aided
floor, I still
Suan's
do 'em.
escape, whatever credit he had gained by helping her replace Suan as Amerlin would evaporate like a dewdrop. And if he was still within Elida's reach when she learned, he would find himself in a cell, and lucky to avoid the headsman. Elaine did not resent his decision to aid Elida. He could not have known enough then to make any other choice. A good many sisters had been confused over what was happening, too. A good many still seemed to be. How could she ask Gawain to see what Aes Sedai could not? As for Galad, she had grown up unable to like the man. Sure, he must resent her, and resent Gawain most of all. Galad had to have thought he would be first Prince of the Sword one day, until Gawain was born. Her earliest memories of him were of a boy, a young man, already behaving more like a father or uncle than a brother, giving Gawain his first lessons with a sword. She remembered being afraid he would break open Gawain's head with a practice blade. But he had never given more than the bruises any youth expected in learning swords. He knew what was right, Galad did, and he was willing to do what was right no matter the cost to anyone, including himself. Light, he had started a war to help her and Nynaeve escape from Samara, and it was likely he had known the risk from the start. Galad fancied Nynaeve, or had for a time. It was hard to imagine he still felt that way, with him a white cloak, but Light only knew where and doing what. But the truth was he had started that war to rescue his sister. She could not condone him being a child of the light. She could not like him, yet she hoped that he was safe and well. She hoped he found his way home to Camelin, too. News of him would have been nearly as welcome as news of Gawain. That surprised her, but it was true. 2 more sisters came while you were away. They're at the Silver Swan. Birgitta made it sound as though they were merely stopping at an inn because every bed in the palace was taken. A green with 2 warders and a gray with 1. They came separately. A yellow and a brown left the same day, so there are still 10 altogether. The yellow went south toward Farmading. The brown was heading east. Stephanie, waiting patiently beside Avienda's tub with nothing to do, exchanged a glance with her sister over Elaine's head, and grinned. Like many in the city, they knew for a fact that the presence of Aes Sedai at the Silver Swan signified White Tower support for Elaine and House Trakan. Watching the two girls like a hawk, Asanda nodded. She knew it too. Every street sweeper and rag picker was aware that the tower was divided against itself. But even so, the name still carried weight, and an image of strength that never failed. Everyone knew the White Tower had lent support to every rightful queen of Andor. In truth, most sisters looked forward to a sitting monarch who was also Aes Sedai, the first in 1,000 years, and the first since the breaking of the world to be openly known as Aes Sedai. But Elaine would not be surprised to find there was a sister in Aramilla's camp, keeping discreetly out of notice. The White Tower never placed all of its coin on one horse unless the race was fixed. "That's enough of the brush," she said, irritably twisting away from the bristles. Well trained, the girl laid the brush down on a stool and handed her a large Ilianer sponge that she used to begin sluicing off soap. She wished she knew what those sisters meant. They were like a grain of sand in her slipper, so tiny a thing that you could hardly imagine it being a discomfort, but the longer it remained, the larger it seemed.
I'll be right back.
The sisters at the Silver Swan were becoming a sizable stone just by being there. Since before she arrived in Camelin, the number at the inn had been changed frequently, a few sisters leaving every week and a few coming to replace them. The siege had not changed anything. The soldiers surrounding Camelin were no more likely to try stopping an Aes Sedai from going where she wanted than were the rebellious nobles in Tyr. There had been reds in the city, too, for a while, asking after men heading for the Black Tower, but the more they learned, the more they had let their disgruntlement show, and the last pair had ridden out of the city the day after Aramilla appeared before the walls. Every Aes Sedai who entered the city was carefully watched, and none of the Reds had gone near the Silver Swan, so it seemed unlikely the sisters there had been sent by Elida to kidnap her. For some reason, she imagined little groups of Aes Sedai scattered from the Blight to the Sea of Storms, and constant streams of sisters flowing between, gathering information, sharing information. A peculiar thought. Sisters used eyes and ears to watch the world and rarely shared what they learned unless it was a threat to the tower itself. Likely those of the Swan were among the sisters sitting out the tower's troubles, waiting to see whether Egwene or Elida would end with the Amerlin seat before they declared themselves. That was wrong. An Aes Sedai should stand for what she thought was right without worrying over whether she was choosing the winning side. But these made her uneasy for another reason. Recently, one of her watchers at the Swan had overheard a disturbing name, murmured and quickly shushed, as if in fear of eavesdroppers. Cadsuane. Not a common name, that. And Cadsuane Maladrin had meshed herself closely with Rand while he was in Cairhien. Van Dien did not think much of the woman, calling her opinionated and mule-headed, but Cariana had almost fainted in awe at hearing her name. It seemed the stories surrounding Cadsuane amounted to legends. Trying to deal with the dragon reborn single-handed was just the sort of thing Cadsuane Maladrin might do. Not that Elaine had concerns about Rand and any Aes Sedai, except that he might outrage her beyond her control. The man was too pig-headed himself sometimes to see where his own good lay. But why would a sister in Camelin mention her name? And why had another hushed her? Despite the hot bath water, she shivered, thinking of all the webs the White Tower had spun through the centuries, so fine that none could see them except the sisters who did the spinning, so convoluted that none but those sisters could have unraveled them. The tower spun webs, the Ajas spun webs, even individual sisters spun webs. Sometimes those schemes blended into one another as though guided by a single hand. Other times they had pulled one another apart. That was how the world had been shaped for 3,000 years. Now the tower had divided itself neatly into rough thirds. 1/3 for Egwene, one for Elida, and one that was standing aside. If those last were in contact with one another, exchanging information, forming plans, the implications. A sudden tumult of voices dimmed by the closed door made her sit up straight. Naris and Stephanie squealed and leaped to clutch one another, staring wide-eyed at the door. What in the bloody flaming... Snarling, Birgitta hurled herself off the chest and out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The voices rose higher. It did not sound as if the guardswomen were fighting, just arguing at the tops of their lungs, and the bond carried mainly anger and frustration, along with her bloody headache. But Elaine climbed out of the bathtub, holding out her arms for Asunda to slip her robe on. The white-haired woman's calmness, and perhaps Elaine's, soothed the two maids enough that they blushed when Asunda looked at them. But Avienda leaped from her tub, splashing water everywhere, and dashed dripping into the dressing room. Elaine expected her to return with her belt knife, but instead she came back surrounded by the glow of Saidar and holding the amber turtle in one hand. With the other, she handed Elaine the angreal that had been in her belt pouch, an aged ivory carving of a woman clothed only in her hair. Excepting the towel atop her head, Avienda wore only a wet sheen, and she angrily waved Stephanie away when the woman tried to put her robe on her. Knife or no knife, Avienda still tended to think as if she were going to fight with a blade, and might need to move suddenly. "Put this back in the dressing room," Elaine said, handing the ivory angreal to Asunda. "Avienda, I really don't think we need to..." The door opened a crack, and Birgitta put her head in, scowling. Naris and Stephanie jumped, not so soothed as they had seemed. "Zaida wants to see you," Birgitta growled at Elaine. "I told her she'd have to wait, but..." With a sudden yelp, she staggered into the room, catching her balance after 2 steps, and whirling to face the woman who had pushed her. The wave mistress of Clan Catalar did not look as though she had pushed anyone. The ends of her intricately knotted red sash swirling about her knees, she entered the room calmly, followed by 2 windfinders, one of whom shut the door in Rasoria's angry face. All 3 swayed when they moved nearly as much as Birgitta did in her heeled boots. Zaida was short, with streaks of gray in her tightly curled hair, but her dark face was one of those that grew more beautiful with the years, and her beauty only seemed magnified by the golden chain, heavy with small medallions, that connected one of her fat golden earrings to her nose ring. More importantly, her air was one of command, not of arrogance, but of the knowledge that she would be obeyed. The windfinders eyed Avienda, still glowing with the power, and Shanella's angular face tightened. Yet, aside from a murmur from Shialin that the Aiel girl was ready to weave, they remained silent and waited. The 8 earrings in Shialin's ears marked her as windfinder to a clan wave mistress, and Shanella's honor chain carried nearly as many golden medallions as that of Zaida herself. Both were women of authority, and it was plain in the way they held themselves and moved, yet one needed to know nothing of the Atha Anmier to know, as soon as one saw them, that Zaida din Parida held the first spot. "Your boots must have tripped you, Captain General," she murmured with a small smile on her full lips, one dark tattooed hand toying with the golden scent box that dangled on her chest. "Clumsy things, boots." She and the 2 windfinders were barefoot as always. The soles of the Atha Anmier's feet were as tough as shoe soles, unbothered by rough decks or cold floor tiles. Strangely, in addition to their blouses and trousers of brightly colored silk brocades, each woman wore a wide stole of plain white that hung below her waist and almost hid her multitude of necklaces. "I was taking a bath," Elaine said in a tight voice, as if they could not see that, with her hair done up and her robe clinging to her damply. Asunda was almost quivering with indignation, which meant she must be beside herself with fury. Elaine felt close to it herself. "I will be taking a bath again as soon as you go. I will speak with you when I have finished taking my bath, if it pleases the light." There. If they were going to shove into her rooms, let them chew on that for ceremony. "The grace of the light be upon you also, Elaine Sedai," Zaida replied smoothly. She raised an eyebrow at Avienda, though neither at the continuing light of Saidar, since Zaida could not channel, nor at her nudity, since the sea folk were quite casual about that, at least out of sight of landmen. "You have never invited me to bathe with you, though it would have been courteous. But we will not speak of that. I have learned that Nesta Dinrius Tumulus is dead, killed by the Shontrap. We mourn her loss. All three women touched their white stoles and touched fingertips to lips. Yet Zyda seemed as impatient with formality as Elaine. Without raising her voice or speeding its pace, she merely pushed on, almost shockingly abrupt and to the point for one of the sea folk. The first 12 of the Atha'anmier must meet to choose another mistress of the ships. What is happening to the west makes it clear there can be no delay. Shailen's mouth tightened, and Shanella raised her pierced scent box to her nose, as if to drown the smell of something. Its spicy perfume was sharp enough to slice through the scent of rose oil in the room. However they had described what they sensed to Zyda, she displayed no unease, or anything but certainty. Her gaze held steady on Elaine's face. We must be ready for whatever comes, and for that we need a mistress of the ships. In the name of the White Tower, you promised 20 teachers. I cannot take Van Deen in her grief or you, but I will take the other 3 with me. The rest the White Tower owes, and I will expect prompt payment. I have sent to the sisters at the Silver Swan to see whether some of them will meet the tower's debt, but I cannot wait on their reply. If it pleases the light, I will bathe with the other wave mistresses tonight at the harbor of Ilion. Elaine fought very hard to keep her own face smooth. The woman just announced that she intended to scoop up every Aes Sedai lying around loose in Camelin and carry them off. And it sounded very much as if she did not intend to leave any of the wave-finders behind. That made Elaine's heart sink. Until Rihanna returned, there were 7 of the kin with sufficient strength to lead a gateway, but 2 of those could not make one large enough to admit a horse cart. Without the Windfinders, plans for keeping Camelin supplied from Tyr and Ilion became problematical at best. The Silver Swan. Light. Whoever Zyda had sent would reveal every line of the bargain she had made. Egwene was not going to thank her for spilling that mess out into the open. She did not think she had ever had so many problems dropped in her lap in the course of one short statement. I regret your loss and the Atha'anmier's loss, she said, thinking fast. Nesta Dinrius was a great woman. She had been a powerful woman anyway, and a very strong personality. Elaine had felt happy to walk away with more than her shift after her one meeting with her. Speaking of shifts, she could not afford time to dress. Zyda might not wait. She belted her robe tighter. We must talk. Have wine brought for our guests, Esanda, and tea for me. Weak tea, she sighed at a burst of caution through the bond to Birgitta. In the smaller sitting room. Will you join me, Wave Mistress? To her surprise, Zyda merely nodded as if she had expected this. That started Elaine thinking about Zyda's side of the bargain between them. The bargains. There were 2, really. And that might be a key point. No one had expected the smaller sitting room to be used for some time, so the air held a chill, even after Sephany rushed with a spark wheel to light the kindling laid beneath split oak on the wide, white hearth and scurried out of the room. Flames leapt up from the fat wood, catching on the log atop the fire irons as the women arrayed themselves in the lightly carved, low-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle in front of the fireplace. Well, Elaine and the seafolk women arrayed themselves, Elaine arranging her robe carefully over her knees, and wishing Zyda had delayed just an hour so she could be properly dressed, the Windfinders coolly waiting for the Wave Mistress to take a chair, then sitting to either side of her. Birgitta stood in front of the writing table with her hands on her hips and her feet apart, her face a thunderhead. The bond carried a clear desire to wring an Atha'anmier neck.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. And I'll be back again tomorrow. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.